لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له ونشهد أن سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله وصلى الله تبارك وتعالى عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم تسليما كثيرا أما بعد. In last week's lesson, we were looking at verse number 13, 14 and 15 of Surah Baqarah. And like the previous verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was again mentioning some evil traits, some evil qualities of the hypocrites. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was talking about their deception. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was talking about their lying, their cheating, their trickery. And some verses with regards to that nature was revealed to show the evilness, the double-facedness, the cheating, the deceptive nature of these types of people. And from verse number 13, when the hypocrite scam was exposed, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exposed the hypocrites that these people are in fact not believers, that verbally they claim to be Muslims, verbally they claim to be believers, whereas in their hearts they had belief which constituted kufr and disbelief. So it was said to them, Aminu kama amananna, that believe as the Sahabas have believed. As I mentioned last week, the word annas here means Sahabas, so believe as the Sahabas believe. But these hypocrites, these munafiqins replied by saying, Qalu anu'minu kama amana sufaha, that shall we believe or shall we become believers as the fools have become believers? The same way these fools, i.e. the Sahabas, have become believers, shall we become like them and accept Iman? Basically, from this particular verse, they made a big slander and they said that the Sahabas, na'uzubillah, they are fools, they are stupid, believing, letting go of their forefathers' religion and then believing in this particular new religion, believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, believing in this person, i.e. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, to be a final prophet. They called the Sahabas fools. And from this particular verse last week, we went on to look at the status of the Sahabas, the status of the companions, and in particular the legal punishment for saying something bad against the Sahaba or talking bad against the Sahaba, calling them fools, calling them this, calling them that. And if it was the Islamic State or in an Islamic country, what would be punishment and what would be the legal punishment if such a person made such a statement. And then we now went on to finish the dars by looking at verse number 14 and 15. And we finished off the dars by looking at a very important topic. And this topic is called in Arabic istidraj, or in Islamic terminology is called istidraj. And istidraj is something which happens to kuffar, but it can also happen to sinful Muslims as well. And the way istidraj works is that the hypocrites, what happened was that they always, said amongst themselves that if Islam is the true religion, and if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala existed, then why doesn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala finish us off? Why doesn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala send a punishment from the heavens and kill us all and finish us off? Because they were thinking to themselves that, look, in front of the Muslims, outwardly we are claiming to be one of them. We would come to the masjid, we would even read namaz, and during Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's time, these hypocrites would even participate in various battles and expeditions. So these hypocrites were thinking to themselves that, look, we're doing all this deception and all this trickery, but we haven't been punished. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hasn't punished us. Our kind of scam and our kind of lie hasn't been exposed. So they start thinking to themselves that if this religion is true and if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala existed, then why isn't it that we are getting punished by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And I replied by saying that this in Islamic terminology is called istidraj. And what does istidraj mean? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala temporarily will give a respite in the punishment. And the whole purpose is so that person, he feels what he has done so that he can do tawbah and istighfar of his shortcomings. But if that person gets overconfident and then he carries on doing that same sin, then when the punishment will come later on, their punishment will be severe and will be great. And I gave the example, well, I'll just give another example for this week, is just say a person who's working in a shop. He's working in a shop, he's working behind the counter. So when the owner of the shop goes somewhere, so when no one's looking, he opens the till and he takes out £10. So obviously that's stealing. There's no doubt about that, that's stealing. Now, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted, Allah could have punished him there and then. And punishing, as I mentioned last week, doesn't necessarily have to be like a punishment from the sky. It could be so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exposed that sin straight away, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala concealed that sin. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him the opportunity now to do tawbah and istighfar of what he had done. Now, if that person does tawbah and istighfar and he feels remorse of the action which he had did and he repays that £10 back, then obviously nothing will happen. The punishment has just passed away. However, if this person now gets overconfident and thinks to himself that, look, this is so easy, when the shopkeeper's not here, just open the till, take £10. So the next day what he does, when the shopkeeper isn't there, he opens the till, takes out a £20 note. And the next day he does that, until what will happen is that this sin which he is committing will come and hit him on his backside. Meaning that will come and will be exposed and he will be made ashamed in front of everyone. The shopkeeper will fire him from his job. The shopkeeper or the community where he is living in, they will know him as a thief, as a stealer. And if in the future, if he wants to get a job, he won't be able to get one. Why? Because of this action which he had did, that he stole from someone. And even though he may repent and even though he may change his life, but in the community people will still know him as a thief and they will be unwilling to give him a job. That is called istidraj. And this is what happened to the hypocrites, because they were thinking to themselves, they were getting overconfident. They were thinking that, look, we're doing all this, deception and so on. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hasn't punished us. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from verse number 15 says, Allahu yastahzi'u bihim. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mocking with them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just given the opportunity that, okay, let them carry on. Okay, Allah has given them respite that, okay, there may be some who may do tawbah from their actions and then they may become pakka, strong believers. But there will be those hypocrites who will get too overconfident, and then when the azab comes, whether in this world or in the hereafter, the azab which will come to them will be very, very grave and will be very, very severe. So that was the topic which I concluded last week's lesson, verse number 14 and 15. Now inshallah we're going to make a start on verse number 16 of Surah Al-Baqarah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala again from this particular verse is indicating towards another evil quality of these hypocrites. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ اشْتَرَوُا الضَّلَالَةَ بِالْهُدَى. That these hypocrites, they had brought, اشتروا means that they have brought الضَّلَالَ, misguidance, بِالْهُدَى, in exchange of guidance. فَمَا رَبِحَتْ تِجَارَتُهُمْ, and their trade, tijarat here means their trade or their investment has brought no gain. وَمَا كَانُوا مُهْتَدِينَ, and nor have they found guidance. Now verse number 16, again Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying to the readers of the Quran and to the Muslims that for the hypocrite, this was like an investment. For the hypocrite, they had this opportunity to become believers. But because of some financial gains, because of some financial motives, they forgot about being believers, they forgot about rectifying and reforming themselves, and instead they chose this way of life. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that فَمَا رَبِحَتْ تِجَارَتُهُمْ, that their investment or their trade has brought no gain. In this world there's no gain in that, because as I mentioned before, living as a hypocrite is not a nice way to live a life, because you're always scared that you may get caught any day, anytime soon. So their investment has brought no gain, وَمَا كَانُوا مُهْتَدِينَ, and nor have they found guidance. Now, what's this? Looking at this verse in more depth, in more detail, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has used the word dalala and huda. And He has described hypocrisy as misguidance, and He has described Islam and Iman as hidayah. Now these hypocrites, they had the opportunity to buy Jannah in this world. They had the opportunity to guarantee themselves paradise in this world. And I quoted the hadith last week of Mishkat al-Masabih, where the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that a person who had seen me, the fire will not touch him. Meaning a Sahaba who has seen Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the fire will not touch that person, indicating that that person is guaranteed Jannah and paradise. So these hypocrites, they had Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in front of them. If they embraced Islam and if they died on Iman, they were guaranteed Jannah. Okay, it's such an easy thing to do, just to believe in Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to basically change your belief, have that firm belief, and then if they died on Iman, they would have been guaranteed Jannah and paradise. But instead, they let their worldly motive, their worldly desires, they let their financial motives and desires take over them, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that these people, in fact, they could have bought hidayah. They could have, if they had become believers, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would have shown them the straight path, would have shown them the Sirat al-Mustaqim, and they would have been guaranteed Jannah and paradise. But instead, they didn't want to, they weren't bothered about hidayah, they weren't bothered about Islam, they weren't bothered about Allah and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but instead they bought misguidance in exchange of guidance. So that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, that they had this opportunity to, get hold of guidance, to be guaranteed Jannah in this world, but instead they brought them misguidance, i.e. they chose the life of hypocrisy, they chose this way of life that outwardly they were claiming to be believers, whereas inwardly they had kufr and disbelief in their hearts. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that their investment, فَمَا رَبِحَتْ تِجَارَتُهُمْ, had brought no gain in this world, وَمَا كَانُوا مُهْتَدِينَ, and nor have they found any guidance. The next verse, verse number 16, and actually all the way until the end of the ruku, which is verse number 20. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about, again, he brings two what he calls similes. And from these two similes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to look at or talk about two types of hypocrites. There were the first category of hypocrites who basically weren't bothered about Islam at all. Even though they saw countless of miracles from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they even came to the masjid, they even prayed with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they even went to the battlefield and saw the various miracles in the battlefield which happened because of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But they weren't bothered about that. They had kufr rooted in their heart. So irrespective of how many miracles Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam showed them, or how many miracles they see from the Sahabas and from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they weren't going to become believers. So that was one category of hypocrites, and their simile and their kind of case and their situation is going to be mentioned from verse 17 and verse 18. And then from verse 19 and 20, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to look at the second category of hypocrites. And the second category of hypocrites are those who actually had some feelings for Islam. They saw the light of Islam, they saw the truth of Islam. But because of, as I mentioned before, some financial gain, some worldly motive, they could not bring themselves to believe in the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and believe in Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the second example, or the second simile which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to mention, is going to talk about those types of hypocrites, whereas the first simile, i.e. verse number 17 and 18, is going to look at those hypocrites who had basically kufr, who had darkness rooted in their hearts, irrespective of how many miracles Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam showed them, irrespective of how many times, they listened to talks of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, talked about Jannah, about the blessing they will receive in Jannah, and about the wa'id and about the severity of Jahannam and so on. It wouldn't have any effect. It's like someone who's really, really evil and so on. So even if you take him to blessed places like Makkah and so on, it won't have an effect on that person. So exactly saying as these munafiqs and these hypocrites, that because they weren't bothered about Islam, because they had kufr and disbelief and darkness rooted in their hearts, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to mention a simile with regard to them. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala goes on to say that مَثَلُهُمْ كَمَثَلِ الَّذِي اسْتَوْقَدَ نَارًا, that their case or their situation is like that of a man اسْتَوْقَدَ نَارًا, who lights a fire or who kindles a fire. فَلَمَّا أَضَاءَتْ مَا حَوْلَهُ, and when the fire illuminates what is around him, ذَهَبَ اللَّهُ بِنُورِهِمْ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes away this fire. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes away this light and this nur. وَتَرَكَهُمْ فِي ظُلُمَاتٍ, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala leaves them in total darkness, لَا يُبْصِرُونَ, so that they cannot see. Now, to understand this particular verse, verse number 17, let's take an example of, like, you're somewhere in a forest or in a jungle. You're in a forest or in a jungle, and just say, for example, you were camping, and, I don't know, just say, for example, one night you just went for a walk, and you lost your way back. Now, the only thing which you have with you is a torch. Now, that torch, because of the light which gives, will enable you, will show you the path, and that path will hopefully take you back to your camp. But just imagine, on the way to the camp, that torch which you had, which was showing you the light, which was showing you the path, the battery, something happens and the battery finishes. Now you're stuck. Now you're in the middle of nowhere. Okay, you're stuck. How are you going to go back to your camp? There's no way you can go. Even if you, like, because it's all pitch black, even if you try to go this way, you're not sure where you're going. If you're going to go this way, you're not sure where you're going, whether you're going to the back or front. Basically you're stuck. You're in the middle of nowhere. You don't know which direction to go. And the lamp which you had, or the torch which you had, the battery had finished, so there was no light there. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing the state of these hypocrites like a light and a person who's lost. That light was Iman. Light was Iman and the truth of Islam, the nur of Islam. And kufr and hypocrisy was darkness. So what happened was that they had lit the fire, meaning they claimed to be Muslims. They had access to go to the masjid and see Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, see the habit of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, see the conduct of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the fellow Sahabas and the companions. So they had nur there. They saw the wahi being revealed to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There were other countless of miracles which they saw Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam do. So they had the nur. But when they chose hypocrisy, when they chose, because they had kufr and hypocrisy in their heart, rooted in their heart. So because when they chose hypocrisy and kufr, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then extinguished that iman, or extinguished the nur and the light of iman, and they were now in darkness. So even though they were still coming to the masjid, even though they were still participating in various battles with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but whatever Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was saying to them, whatever the companions were saying to them, because their heart was so black, okay, it was so dark, there was darkness inside, there was kufr inside, it didn't have an effect on them. It's like when I was doing the tafsir of the verse خَتَمَ اللَّهُ عَلَىٰ قُلُوبِهِمْ وَسَمْعِهِمْ and so on. It's like that. Now it's become so black, so dark, that any kind of goodness could not enter into the heart. Why? Because the heart has now become concealed with the kufr and with hypocrisy. And from verse number 18, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes them and says, Summum bukmun umyun fahum la yarji'un. That these hypocrites are deaf. Summum means that these hypocrites are deaf. Bukmun, they are dumb. Umyun, they are blind. Fahum la yarji'un, and they shall not return. Now from verse number 18, the topic which I'm going to talk about for the next 10 minutes or so is something, or is a topic with regards to disability in Islam, or with regards to disabled people in Islam. Because if a non-Muslim or someone who doesn't know anything about the Quran or about Islam or anything like that, if he was to have like one glance over verse number 18, he will think to himself that Islam treats disabled people in a degrading way. Because in this particular verse, it seems as though that these hypocrites are saying as disabled people, like someone who is blind, someone who is deaf, someone who is dumb, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has basically said that these hypocrites are like them. Obviously, the actual meaning in this context is that the same way someone who is blind, he cannot see the nur of Islam. A person who is, say, deaf, he cannot hear the nur of Islam and the truth of Islam. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that these people are like them. So the topic which I'm going to mention in the next few minutes or so is with regards to disability, or what does Islam say with regards to disabled people. Now the first thing which we're going to look at is that Islam looks at disabled people or disability as neutral. Meaning that disability is not considered as a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and more importantly, it's not considered as a curse from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Many people, well not many, there are some people who think that if a person has a disabled son in his family or a disabled daughter in his family, then they start saying, oh, there's something wrong with this family is cursed and so on. But the truth of the matter is that in Islam, we consider disability to be something which is neutral. It's not a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and nor is it a curse from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as mentioned before, that because our reason, or because of our creation, or why we are in this world, one of the reasons why we are in this world is so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can test us. So even a disabled people, he will be tested by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but his test will be according to his limits and his capability. So the first thing first is that disabled people, they are looked at neutrally in Islam. We don't consider them to be like a curse from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and nor is it considered as a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, after we've deduced this particular point, it is very, very important that we never look down or degrade a disabled person. Someone or anyone who's got some kind of like illnesses or mental illnesses, or who may be like partially deaf, partially blind, and so on, we should never ever degrade that person. We should never ever look down upon that person. When Islam is treating them neutrally, when Islam doesn't consider them to be, for example, a curse from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or anything like that, then we don't have any right to look down upon someone who may have some disabilities, or someone who's got some problems like he's partially deaf, partially blind. We are not allowed to look down upon them. We are not allowed to make fun out of them. We are not allowed to degrade them. And this particular viewpoint can be determined from the Holy Quran. There is a chapter in the 30th para called Surah Abasa wa Tawalla. And if you look at the cause of revelation for that particular surah and for the particular initial few verses, it was with regards to an incident which happened between Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and a blind Sahabi in the name of Sayyiduna Abdullah ibn Maktum radiyallahu anhu. And Imam Baghawi rahmatullah alayhi, the great Mufassir, he takes up the story, and he says that once Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was in a meeting, he was engaged in some dialogue with the leaders of the Quraysh, with the leaders of the disbelievers. And there was some hope that, well, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam hoped, and it looked like that these people were going to become believers and Muslims. So what happened was, this blind Sahabi in the name of Sayyiduna Abdullah ibn Maktum radiyallahu anhu, he burst into the circle or into this gathering where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is having this kind of discussion and dialogue with the disbelievers, and he says to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that teach me a surah, or teach me a ayah, according to some narration, that teach me a verse of the Holy Quran, or teach me a surah of the Holy Quran. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because he was busy in this kind of discussion with the disbelievers, he disliked this intrusion, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam turned his face away from Sayyiduna Abdullah ibn Maktum radiyallahu anhu, and he carried on doing what he was doing. Upon which the verse Abasa wa Tawalla and Ja'ahul A'ma was revealed. And A'ma means blind. And from here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned the excuse why he did this, why Sayyiduna Abdullah ibn Maktum radiyallahu anhu like burst into the circle. He didn't do it purposely, he didn't do it intentionally, but the reason why he did it is because he was blind and he couldn't see what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was doing, or what Rasulullah, or with whom Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was with. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that, look, Sayyiduna Abdullah ibn Maktum radiyallahu anhu, he was ma'zur, he had an excuse, he was blind, he couldn't see what was happening, so therefore for you to reprimand him wasn't correct. And this particular verse was revealed to basically warn Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that, you know, he's dealing with this matter in this particular situation wasn't correct, or wasn't according to the status of a Nabi and of a Prophet of Allah, subhanallah, of the Prophet of Allah. So that is the verse, or from this particular incident we can see the importance of respecting someone who is disabled. Someone who, for example, is partially blind and so on, then we shouldn't like make, if someone is blind, then we shouldn't basically, look down upon him or degrade him because he's blind. Or if someone, say, for example, is deaf, then we shouldn't use that to basically make fun out of him that he's deaf and so on and so forth. And this applies with other kind of disabilities, like if a person's got skin problem or some other kind of problems and so on, or if a person's got some mental illnesses and so on. So again, you shouldn't use that and basically use it to mock that person or to degrade that particular individual. So that is the first particular point, and that is what does Islam say with regards to disabled people. The next point is, again, some people may ask this particular question, and that is that what is the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creating disabled people? That why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create people who are disabled? Now, one of the belief of Iman is that you have to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and at the same time you have to believe in His attributes as well. The same way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ar-Rahman Rahim, you have to believe in these attributes. Similarly, one of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that Allah is Hakim. Hakim means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is wise. That whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does, whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders or commands, or whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates, whatever He wills, whatever He decreases, everything is done with hikmah and done with wisdom. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He doesn't create anything which is vain. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't create anything which is useless. Every creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is some benefit in them. Even something like some poisonous animals and so on, even them there is some benefit in them. So whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created, there is some benefit in them. Now similarly, someone who is disabled, that is also a creation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So again, there is some benefit in that creation of a person who may be disabled or a person who may have some mental illnesses and so on. And what is the benefit and what is the wisdom, scholars have written, is so that this illness or this disability may become a cause to test the individual himself and the family members and those who are around this disabled person. Now you need to understand, you need to realize that we being sent in this world is a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And many people, they are tested in many different ways. Take the example of Hazrat Ayyub alayhi salam, the Prophet Ayyub alayhi salam. He was tested by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the way he was tested by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was that before he had everything. But then for 7 years, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inflicted the Prophet Ayyub alayhi salam with an illness called leprosy. And during that time, he had 7 daughters and 7 sons. All of them died because of this particular illness and from other causes as well. And during that time, because this was some kind of new illness, people, they feared that if we go next to Ayyub alayhi salam, then we may catch this illness as well. So what they did was that they left Sayyidina Ayyub alayhi salam, a prophet of Allah, they left him near the dumping area, the rubbish area of the city, and they left him there for 7 years. But during that time, Sayyidina Ayyub alayhi salam, he did not complain once. He didn't say to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, why did you make me like this and so on. He thanked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala during that 7 years, and he did sabr and he was patient during that time. So what I'm trying to say is that people, they are tested in different ways. Some people, they may be tested financially, that they are working but they can't afford to pay the bills and so on, the mortgage or the rent of the house and so on and so forth. So they are tested financially. So during that time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will see what does that person do. Does he in that situation turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or would that person in that situation sell his iman and do something which is haram and lawful to pay off his debt? Then you may have other individuals, or like for example a couple, say, who have got everything. They have big massive house, they have a mansion, they have nice cars, they have everything what they want, they have money and so on, and they have a disabled son or they have a disabled daughter. So even though they are not being tested financially, but then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives them a disabled son or a disabled daughter, and that disabled son or a daughter is a test for the parent. Okay, that how would they react in those situations or in that particular situation. And those who may have someone disabled in your family and so on, we know how difficult it is to raise a disabled son or a disabled daughter. Okay, it's not something which is very easy. Okay, many people I've heard that, during when they're looking after the disabled son and so on, because it gets too much for them, some of them, they feel like even killing their disabled son, they feel like they're killing their disabled daughter, they even feel like killing themselves because they can't take the, the pressure, they can't, the depression and everything, looking after this son, or this child who's got a lot of illnesses, got a lot of problems, and, like 24 hours looking after them, hardly any sleep, hardly, putting strain on everything, the marriage of the couple and so on. So that is itself is a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given that particular test to that particular family to show or to see what they do in that situation. Would they, say, for example, do something which is haram, or would they, in that situation, thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and say to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that even though, we just have a disabled son and so on, but there are many couples who don't even have children, or they can't even have children. So looking at it in a positive way. So that's the main thing of like disabled people, that the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creating them is so that they can serve as a test for the couple themselves and also for the individuals and family members who are around this particular sick person. Now that is the second issue. The third issue which we're going to look at with regards to disabled people or those who have mental illnesses is with regards to their namaz and their fasting. That are they obliged to read namaz, are they obliged to fast and so on. Now, with regards to all the worships in Islam, one of the main requisites or one of the main prerequisites and conditions is that you have to be sane. That you have to be sane for your namaz, for namaz to be obligatory. You have to be sane for fasting to be obligatory. Same applies for zakat, same applies for hajj as well. Now, the masla is that if a person, if he is really like seriously mentally ill and he or she doesn't understand the concept of namaz, he or she doesn't understand what namaz means or the procedure of reading namaz and so on, or like for example what is fasting and what you can do in fasting, what you can't do in fasting and so on. If they are in such a state, the illness is such that they can't even understand these kind of things, which is like a basic requirement for fasting and namaz and zakat and so on, then these people are not required to read namaz and they are not required to fast. So that is the first ruling and the first masla, that if the illness is such that they don't understand the concept of namaz, they don't understand the concept of fasting, and their illness is so severe and so bad that they don't know what to do and so on, then in those situations they are not required to fast and they are not required to read the namaz. And this can be deduced from a hadith of Sunan Abu Dawood, Sunan Tirmidhi, Sunan Nasai and Sunan Ibn Majah, where the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that the pen has been lifted from 3. Meaning the pen has been lifted from 3. Meaning the pen here, the Kiram Katibin, if a person does good, then it's written down, but if a person does bad, then it's written down and so on. But the pen has been lifted from 3. And who are those 3? Number 1, a sleeping person until he wakes up. So if a person, if he was sleeping or if he was sleepwalking or something like that, and he did something, he broke something and so on, then he's not liable, he's not accountable for that. Number 2, a minor until he matures. So a child who is still immature, so if he does something bad and so on, then he is not accountable. And number 3, an insane person until he comes to his senses. So someone who's insane, someone who doesn't have that, because of his intellectual disability, does not understand namaz and so on, then the pen is lifted from him, meaning that it is not compulsory for him to read namaz and to fast and to do any other acts of worship. So that is the first situation. Then you have another situation with regards to someone who's disabled or who has mental illnesses, and that is that he can read namaz. Like for example, when he sees people and so on, he can actually read namaz and so on. Then in that situation, if that person's situation or his illness is such that he can actually read namaz, by looking at other people, he can actually read namaz and so on, then it becomes compulsory for that disabled person to read namaz. Okay? If his illness is not that severe, or sometimes he gets these kind of these disabilities or his mental illness sometimes comes up and so on. But generally speaking, he's okay, and he can, and by looking at other people, he can actually read namaz. Then in that situation, namaz becomes compulsory upon that individual. Now the question with regards to number 2, or the second scenario, is with regard to recitation in the namaz. As you know, recitation is fard in namaz. So what should that disabled person do in namaz? Now the ruling is that it depends on that person's level and his capability. If, say for example, he's disabled but he can read his namaz, but he cannot speak properly. You get other kind of people who are quite able, they can like go for a shower, they can go to the toilet and so on, but they cannot speak properly. They got some disabilities, they cannot speak. So if it's such an illness where they cannot speak, or they can speak but it's very, very little, or basically they can't speak at all, then obviously they don't have to recite anything in namaz. They will have to read the namaz, but whilst they're in the standing position, they will just remain quiet for a few seconds, and then they will go into ruku for a few seconds, get up from ruku, and then go for sajda for a few seconds, and so on and so forth. And that's how they would perform their salah. However, if they can recite something, then the scholars have written that it's preferable that if they could recite Subhanallah or something short like that, then that will be sufficient and that will be okay. Okay, so again, it depends on the level and the capabilities of that particular individual. Okay, so if they, for example, are really, severely disabled, meaning that they cannot speak anything at all, then obviously you will tell them that, okay, you can read your namaz if you are able to do so, but you don't have to recite anything. And however, if they can recite something, then obviously you will advise them to recite Subhanallah, Alhamdulillah, and so on. And if they are quite better than that, even better than that, meaning that they can even recite Surah Al-Fatiha and so on, then obviously that will be encouraged. So it depends on the level and the capabilities of that particular individual. Now the last mas'ala which we're going to look at before we conclude, again, is with regards to disabled people. But this particular mas'ala appears or is asked before they are born. Now what do I mean by that is, like, sometimes a parent or parents will know, or they will be told by doctors that this child is going to be born disabled, or is going to be born with some kind of genetic diseases and so on. Now the question is that in that situation, would the couple will be allowed to abort the child or not? So the mas'ala we're looking at now for the next few minutes is with regards to abortion, and in particular whether aborting a child who may be born with disabilities or with genetic diseases, whether that is permissible in Islam or not. Now, before we go on to that particular mas'ala, just generally speaking, what Islam says with regards to abortion is that obviously in Islam, life is something which is sacred, and to abort a child, then that is akin to killing someone. So therefore, it is, just generally speaking, it is considered haram to abort a child. Now, it comes to the hadith of Sahih al-Bukhari and Sunan ibn Majah, narrated by Sayyidina Abdullah bin Mas'ud radhiyallahu anhu. It's a long hadith, but the gist of the hadith is that the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that the semen, it enters the woman's womb, it stays there for 40 days, then after that it becomes a nutfa, then after that, after another 40 days, then it becomes a alaqa, then it becomes a clot of blood. And then on the 120th day, the malaika, the angel, will come and they would put a soul, or they would put the ruh inside this clot of blood. Now, from this, the scholars have deduced that 120 days, or after 120 days, this clot of blood becomes a kind of human being. So therefore, to abort a child after 120 days is strictly haram. It's strictly prohibited. Okay? Whether it's for like genetic diseases, whether it's for mental illness and so on, even though the doctors may say that, look, this child is going to be born disabled and so on and so forth, if 120 days have elapsed, it is considered haram and it is unlawful to abort the child. The only situation it is considered permissible is that if the mother's life is in danger. Okay, if the doctors have said that, look, if you don't have an abortion, the mother will die and so on, and if this is kind of quite certain, there's a very, very good chance, like 90% or over 50% chance, then only then it will be permissible to abort the child after 120 days. Before 120 days, because the ruh hasn't been put into the clot of blood yet, so therefore the scholars have said that even before 120 days, it is still impermissible. It is still unlawful to abort the child. However, if there are some valid reasons, some valid excuses, then it may become permissible. And some valid excuses they mention is, again, if the mother's life is in danger, or if a woman has become pregnant due to rape or fornication and so on, and other kind of illnesses or excuses, the scholars have permitted aborting a child before 120 days. And even Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahmatullah has written in his fatwa that, after 120 days it is considered haram and unlawful. And he's also mentioned that this is an ijma. Ijma basically means a consensus of all the ulama. So before 120 days, if there is some kind of excuses, as I just mentioned, then it may become permissible. Now, going back to the question with regards to if a child is going to be born with genetic diseases or with mental illnesses, whether a couple will be allowed to abort or not. So obviously, if it's after 120 days, as mentioned, strictly haram, strictly prohibited. But before 120 days, then as long as it is certain, obviously nothing certain in life, but as long as there's a very, very good chance, like more than 50%, a good 60, 70, 80%, a team of doctors, not only one doctor, but a team of doctors, God-fearing Muslim doctors have said that because of the way the pregnancy is or has been, then this child is going to be born with some genetic diseases, with mental illnesses, then before 120 days, it may become permissible. Okay, and this is actually deduced from a very famous book in the Hanafi Mazhab called Raddul Mukhtar, written by Allama Ibn Abidin al-Shami rahmatullah alayh. So before 120 days, then it will be permissible, but after 120 days, then it would not be permissible at all. Inshallah, just leave it until there for this week. And that's one of the tawfiq to accept on what's been said. Wa akhlu da'wa alhamdulillah. Does anyone have any questions?